We are reaching the end of the book of Exodus, and the fourth last verse talks about Moses being able to enter the tent of meeting. And the verse says, "V'lo yochel Moshe lavo el oel moed," and Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting. Asks Rashi, hang on a minute, "Lo yochel Moshe lavo el oel moed," how can the verse say that Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting? V'kosov echad oimer, and there's another verse that says in the book of Numbers, "Bevoy Moshe el oel moed," and in the coming of Moses to the tent of meeting. Seems that he could enter the tent of meeting. Answers Rashi, not a difficulty, because there's a third verse that says, the third verse that determines between them and says, Ki shochen alav hanan, for the cloud covers over it. And the question here is that, hang on a minute, this is not really a third verse. This is actually the continuation of our first verse, the verse that I read from the book of Exodus. It goes like this: Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because resided upon it was the cloud. So how can Rashi, when he asks the question, forget that the verse itself, the first verse, is not a third verse, it's the first verse. The first verse says he could not because the cloud resided upon it. And the verse in the book of Numbers is not the second out of three, it's the second verse, which is understood in the context of the first verse, is that it must have been that the cloud wasn't there. And the answer is that when we first encounter these verses, so there's only two verses. And the two verses are about, is God accessible or not? Does God want to be accessed by Moses or does he not? And the fact that there's a cloud is not the determinant on whether he wants to be accessible or not. It's just a sign of how magnificent the tent of meeting is. It's a place where the cloud could, sometimes did and sometimes didn't reside. Well, the cloud sometimes comes down, says Moses, gee whiz, the cloud. This is a place which could have a manifestation, a divine, miraculous manifestation of the presence of God. I ain't going close. Or it's a place where it may or may not have the cloud. That's a place where God can be found. I'm going in. The cloud is not a determinant of whether he would go in or could go in or should go in. It's just a sign of how magnificent the place was. And so the question remains in Rashi's mind, is the tent of meeting accessible or not accessible? Being a place which can have the cloud that residing upon it. Says Rashi, that's not the determinant. Those two verses will not determine. What will determine is not how much God is accessible, but how much Moses wanted to access God. And the way we have to change it is that alav, ki shochen alav he'anan, for resided upon, and here's a pronoun, it could be maybe it or him, will determine whether Moses went in or didn't go in. Ki shachan olav he'anan, for resided upon him, not upon it, upon him the cloud. If it's resided on it, the cloud, then we still don't have a determinant. But if it's because it resided on him, the cloud, now we understand. It's a third verse because the first two verses talk about the oil moed. They're referring to the location. The third verse refers to the person. Who was Moses? What kind of human being was he? You know what? You can't determine whether the tent of meeting was accessible or not accessible from the verses, but you can determine it from if you know who Moshe Rabbeinu was. Moshe Rabbeinu was a person that if he was moving from the clarity of this world into the cloudiness of another, not interested. I'm not going. If I have to leave the natural order in order to access a cloudy spiritual order, not going. Kishachon Olav Hanon, because resided on him the cloud. Not interested. If there's a cloud, Moses is not going. And if there's no cloud, Moses is going. The determinant is not whether the tent of meeting was a place where God wanted or didn't want access. It's determined by whether Moshe Rabbeinu was prepared or wanted to access God under those circumstances or not. And that's the greatest lesson of all. The greatest lesson is not that Moses wanted to know, does God want me to access him, or does God not want me to access him? For that, there's only two verses which seem to contradict each other. And the reason is because in some senses God does want us to access him. In some senses God does not want us to access him, because, as we know, the access of God is only a means. But when it becomes an end, it's a problem. So access him or don't access him. But what determines whether Moses would or would not enter would be, does Moses want to access God? Moses only wants to access God if it doesn't take him out of the clarity of the natural order. That's the lesson we learn from towards the end of this second book of Exodus.